Hello Prowi, this is Matty again. I'm going to be going through the map on my own now, just to see if I can give you a bit of better feedback. Let's turn sheets on. Cool. Right, I'll just fly through map a little bit. Okay, first I'd like to touch on visuals. No doubt you already understand what I've been trying to tell you. The way I understand things anyway, as an amateur, a very amateur level designer, things that I picked up over the years, is that high contrast shades like this can be visually uncomfortable. If you have a bright colour against pitch black, then that can be difficult to view. So one of the ways in which you can tone that down is by reducing the amount of bright colour and just having more dark colour, and then keeping the amount of bright colour you know, smaller, like this over here. This is acceptable as long as it's not tiling to a massive space. That's pretty good because the lines are pretty thin. Here is another great way to deal with it. You have two colours here, this pink line and the purple sort of background colour, which are very similar shades. They're not too far apart from each other, so it's still fairly easy to view. Also, there's foreground and background. Foreground details tend to be high density, so there'll be noisy textures like this where you've got lots of stuff going on and you've got bright things that stick out at you, whereas background textures tend to be like this, darker, not much going on, simpler materials. So that's great examples there. You use high detailed brighter materials to draw attention to objectives. So in the case of Deathrun, the objective would be the path, or it would be trap mechanics, elements, things like that, things that the player has to avoid. There we are. Oh, I never saw this bit before. Okay, this is a lot of text. I don't understand it, and hardly anyone's going to see this. If you have selections to make in your map, try and keep them simple, because only a very small number of people are going to be able to see this, and it's going to be gone before anyone has the chance to read it, because some plonker will come along and just pick a button. If you have choices to make, then make sure there aren't any buttons that people can just immediately press without understanding what's going on. One way you can do that is by having a timer, so people must stand and read this for 10 seconds before a choice is made. Another way is you can have a voting system. So you could have a bunch of platforms, for instance. Say you had 4 choices, you could have 4 boxes or 4 platforms. Players would jump onto the platforms, and then at the end of a timer, a count would be made, and the platform with the most players on it would be the one that would get chosen. Democratic, you know? Pretty cool. What I will do actually, since you're using signs with wording on and stuff, is I will just do my texture resolution. I reduce my texture resolution. Okay, unfortunately you have a lot of numpties who think it's a really good idea to put these awesome configs in Team Fortress 2 to reduce the graphical fidelity and increase frame rates. Amazing. But unfortunately for us Deathrun mappers, it makes life a little bit more difficult because you have to convey important information to them, and you can't do that if the textures have reduced resolution. So if ever you have a material like this, which is very important for people to read, all you have to do is open the texture file, the VTF, in VTF Edit if you're using that, and on the left hand side you'll see the flags. Go to the flags and make sure that no level of detail is enabled, ticked, and then resave the VTF. And what that does is it ensures that on low texture resolution settings like what I have now, that texture will always be shown at full resolution. Another thing is whether or not people can spray on information materials like this. If somebody can come along and spray on something, they can block the text. So one way that you can do that is if it's a brush entity like this, which is probably a Funk brush, typically they cannot be sprayed on, so that's fine, you don't have to worry about it. But one thing you could do is you could put a block bullets brush over things. That prevents things from being sprayed. But you can also edit the VMT of your material and give it the no decal parameter, which I believe is $no decal space 1. And as the name suggests, decals cannot be applied to that face, so you cannot shoot them and you cannot spray them. So players, malicious players, can't cover up stuff with sprays that they shouldn't be allowed to. But if you feel like you want to do that on every material, please don't, because players do like to spray on things. It's fun. If it destroys the look and feel of the map, yeah, I can sympathise with that, but still have some places where players can obviously spray. So perhaps what you could have is a dedicated spray wall like in Neo-Noir, or you could have certain materials like this which are sharp, that do not allow sprays on them, and flat materials which are smooth and matte-like. Perhaps they can act like a canvas for people to spray. So what you could have is like just maybe these sections that appear around the map now and again where people can spray on. No busting, very nice. Yeah, this room, it's not really obvious what to do here, but that's probably fine because it's beta. But like I said before, if you give players a choice, most of the time only the people at the very front who rush out are going to be able to make that choice. So for something like music selection, you might want to make it randomized or put it into a list. Ivy is nice. That, you know, plays one after the other. Oh, I've got an email. Rightio, let's continue, shall we? Okay, I like the appearance of this area. It's like a welcoming hall. You go through these doors and wow, look what's going on. It's almost like I've entered Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. But this flashing white wall here is a bit distracting, and also the walls are rather noisy. Ideally, the sides here should be quite simple, because these materials and these lasers, sorry, these platforms, these lasers and these spikes are really what people should be focusing on. If you were to stand here, you'd have all these things overlaying over each other, and it would make it more difficult to see where to go. It would be visually confusing, uncomfortable, and this place in particular, you don't want people to feel overwhelmed because it's particularly challenging. It's the start of the map, so it's the introduction area. You don't want people to feel bad here. So like I said, I'm just going to speak about visuals for now, so I'm just going to race through everything else. I'm not going to talk about trap design. I don't think these palm trees really suit this area, but you don't really notice them anyway because there's so much going on. It wasn't obvious to us earlier on where it was safe to stand. Here you have lasers, and up until now, lasers to us are dangerous. So why should we go through these lasers? You know, that's almost like we're going to die. So I would get rid of those if I were you. Up until now, white things have been dangerous. So this white thing, it doesn't look like you're supposed to stand on it. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that you must go around it and between it rather than on top of it. So try and stick to the same kind of textures and themes for the same kind of elements. So if something is dangerous, try and use the same colour. If something is safe, try and use the same colour. So maybe safe materials could be things like this. Maybe you could have a slight effect on them, a walkable effect. Think about, you know, the diamond grip metal textures you get in Team Fortress 2 that show people that this is a walkable space, but something that better fits your environment. And if you gave this a little platform here, the same material, then players would probably understand then that they have to get on it. Yeah, and then when they reach the end, if indeed they actually have to stand on here, I'm not even sure if they do, there's nothing that suggests that they can't just go left in the first place. Do you have invisible walls? It's not obvious. This is I like this scrolling effect. It's quite attractive, but the flashing lasers here are very bright, and the white section here is also very bright. The problem with everything being the same colour with no shading is that you cannot gauge depth. So as I come round here, you know that you're supposed to go there, but you've got this white bright thing in your face. You've got these scrolling textures, this flashing laser thing, and then you've also got this thing that you've got to avoid as well. So it really is a lot of information to process, and probably very easy for people to get confused. Here you have lasers again, so that's fine. We know now that lasers are dangerous, but the problem is that all these lines and lasers aren't the same colour, and there's a lot of them. You also have 3 of them side by side, so it's difficult to kind of judge where the lasers are through them. So you've got this thing to worry about, whether or not the next platform is going to be safe. You also have the scrolling things, so you've got multiple elements here. I just realised I'm starting to talk about trap design. So yeah, what I would do is get rid of these lasers and maybe just have some kind of square instead. You are apparently no stranger to material proxies, unless this is an animated VTF, I'm not entirely sure. But you can make VMTs, material proxies, scroll. So what you could have is you could have like a laser field, not laser, a force field effect. Think about the Half-Life 2 Combine force fields. So if you had a brush with a scrolling material on, you could, that would be transparent, people could see through it, and it wouldn't be as visually distracting, say, you know. It would also help to reduce the number of edicts in your map, because a laser entity is one edict, whereas a brush, of course, a non-solid brush, doesn't actually have to consume any edicts at all. We didn't really understand what was going on here. We stood here and pressed the button for a long time, but we weren't actually sure when it was ready to use. I suspect that there's some kind of logic issue here preventing us from using the button too much. There does appear to be some kind of sign, but it was so high up and the arrow flashing, it didn't really notice it. And of course, constantly spamming the button, the likelihood is that that sign isn't really going to get seen anyway, because it'll be on for a split second and it'll just disappear. So I would try to remove this manual element and just have a recurring automatic element. It doesn't really need to be manual. The good thing about having an automatic element where the platforms just appear after a while and then disappear is that players can stand here for a bit and observe and get a sense of the timing. And when they're confident, they can jump, whereas, well, you know. These platforms here, they do not appear to have the power to make you bounce upwards. This detailed texture looks attractive, it's the same one as the wall, and therefore to me it just looks decorative. It doesn't look like it should thrust me upwards, so I would think about getting a dedicated catapult material that looks like it should push you upwards. Unless, of course, you can make also a shaped brush, or maybe some kind of lines that come off it, like a hologram effect, which perhaps scroll upwards, so players know that they go in the direction that the material is scrolling. Later on in the map, you did start to use a theme for elements that catapult you upwards. There were these kind of purple things with lasers. And that I did realise then that the later platforms that use the same texture also pushed you upwards. So that was good. I really don't understand what you're supposed to do here. I never really got through this, so I don't know. This is all black. I can make out what's going on because I've got this special material that I use for mapping, but because it's all black, again, there's no shading, there's no sense of how do I put this? You can't really define the environment in your mind, so you don't actually know if that's part of the ceiling or whatever. I like the scrolling material effect here, that's pretty cool. I think the ceiling and floor are a little bit too noisy. I would simplify those a bit, because if you're standing here and looking forwards, your eye is naturally drawn to the ceiling and the floor. So if you were to simplify those by reducing the contrast of them, either by making these dots darker or bringing the background up so it matched the dots, or just by getting rid of the dots completely and having just a flat surface, that would allow us to focus on what's in front of us. These lasers, they have a lot of noise. I would just make them straight or just have a very small amount of noise. Their animation speed is a little bit too quick as well, I think, and maybe they could do with being a little bit thinner. If you can't make them thinner though, because you need to indicate to players the bounds of the lasers, then perhaps you would consider sourcing an alternative sprite texture which is larger, if possible. But yeah, they're quite noisy and quite distracting, and they block your vision somewhat. Unless you could do what I suggested earlier and replace it with a force field effect, you know. I thought this was a platform earlier on that you could stand on. I didn't actually know where to go, because the platforms here get very thin. And I did not realise that this was some kind of catapult until I saw people jumping on it. You can kind of infer that it's a catapult because you start higher, you then drop down, and that appears to be the only way you can get over here. But I'd only know that because I played Neo-Noir, which, you know, it looks the same here. So this area here, I think the flashing walls is very distracting. It distracted me from what I should have been focusing on. I did only realise that the trick here was to look at the ceiling until after some time had passed. You do have the ceiling flashing, but because you've got the large bits of wall flashing, it distracted me. So if you stop those from flashing, then I should naturally look upwards. And again, I'd maybe simplify these wall panels here so they're not as distracting. Perhaps you could soften them or something, I don't know. You want players to focus on what's going on up there. I really like this room. I think this is probably my favourite part of the map. The problem is, though, that all of these platforms that I have to go on are the same kind of height as each other, so it makes it difficult for me to judge their position in the room. So from this perspective, I can't really see a path. So I suppose one way that you could improve that is by having us start higher in the room, looking down on the path. So here I can see that I've got to go left and then apparently right and then a bit further on. Although it's difficult to see further on because the platform is a bit further away. So perhaps you could have some kind of large block element here where I'm zooming back and forth to serve as an obvious partition. So from this perspective, it would be obvious that it would sort of snakes around, if you know what I mean, towards the end there. But you could also improve the situation by reducing the amount of visual detail again. Maybe on this final area is just have all this one solid colour, and then make the tunnels noisy. It also bothers me a little bit that the walls here, the texture doesn't line up with the floor. So what you could do is perhaps align this texture so that the bottom of the diamonds meet the floor, and then increase the scale of the floor texture or get an alternative texture so that the lines come away from the bottom of the diamonds. If you stick to brush sizes which are a power of 2, for instance 64, 128, 256, 512, etc., and you have materials which are the same size, then it's a lot easier to align materials. But as it stands, this is very noticeable. At the very least, what you could do is just drop the diamonds down so that the joins here reach the floor and weren't just interrupted in going into blackness. And then you could align the materials here so that the blue lines go all the way up to the edge of the wall, which would cap off the floor, you know? Imagine you were tiling a floor in a kitchen in real life. You would want the edges to meet nicely with the walls, so it's the same situation there, really. So yeah, if you approach this from top-down view, it'd be a bit more obvious what you've got to do. If you don't want to do that, then I suppose you know you've got to start here, but this kind of big laser beam gets in the way a bit. I don't understand why you've got one. Oh yeah, because you've got a big empty hole. Yeah, so I would probably duplicate this to either side. I'd maybe indicate that this is the jumping off point, have a platform here or an overlay or something, or maybe even extend this platform out from this ledge so players know that they have to start here. You don't have to have everything as a jump, you know. So yeah, the lasers here, they intersect this platform, and I was not prepared for that at first. I thought that the lasers would actually go between the platforms. So just to make things easier, I would either move these platforms so that they occupy the spaces rather than the lasers, or make the platforms a different colour so that players know that they are in the path of one of the lasers. They're more dangerous. What you could do is make the surrounding platforms darker shade, so you can make them like a nice darker purple. And then the platforms which are going to get hit by the lasers, you can make them pink, so players know that they're going to be hit by the pink lasers. You could also have some kind of guide, laser guides. If you've played the Mr. Booby minigame in Neo-Noir, you'll have seen that before the lasers actually hit you, they kind of flash on for a second. The way Bun does that is he has a cylindrical funk brush. Not the best solution in my opinion. Looks a bit naff, so what you could do is you could have the same laser entity. You could constantly change it from pink to kind of another colour, and the other colour could be like a very faint grey, almost like a ghost of a laser, so players could see where the laser was going to be. You get the impression, get the idea anyway, what I'm trying to say. This, I like the fact that you've got a safe zone here, a rest spot. I would make it larger to accommodate more players. But it looks like you should be able to jump from here to here. And I appreciate that you've given people that opportunity, apparently, to make that ballsy jump. But there's just so much going on here that I think most of the time they're just going to stick with the safe jump. Yeah, try and make jumping off points into other hazards larger platforms. It's a bit unfair to have a small jumping off platform, because this should be what players should be tackling. if you slip off this platform because it's such a small amount of space and you fall, you're going to feel pretty darn upset that you died because the platform wasn't big enough, you know? Whereas players should feel like they died because they didn't jump properly, or they weren't patient enough for lasers to go away, or they didn't time their jumps properly. If they die to this trap here, I think they won't be dissatisfied because they know what the mistake they made and they'll want to try it again next time. Otherwise, though, you know, that just feels cheap. I like the transition into this room, and I like these scrolling materials here. It almost feels like I've jumped into a computer, and I think you could probably run with that and do something with it. Veli made the point that it's very difficult to see these moving obstacles here against the white backdrop, and I agree. Because the hazardous elements in this room are the platforms and the rotating things, it makes sense that they should be bright, but they should not be competing for your visual attention against the white backdrop. You should have the backdrop dark. Also, these lasers, I hardly even saw them because they're the same colour as the blue down there, and they overlay each other quite a lot, so it's difficult to kind of judge where they are. So again, what you could do is you could get rid of the lasers and just have the force field brushes, you know. This section, strafe jumping is very difficult. I know that the map is supposed to be difficult, but you know, it can't be too difficult. So I would make these blocks here transparent so that you can see the platforms on the other side. The Team Fortress 2 downlighter does not really fit your environment. I would get rid of these to replace it with something else. The Kronk thing doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Fine, it's a meme, I suppose. Great, whatever. When you jump here, this looks like this is where you should be standing. There's no indication that the platform should be invisible. So what I would do is I would make the first platform transparent. So have it like see-through, you know? You could even have a see-through gradient. So it starts off solid or opaque, and then it gets more and more transparent. So you kind of lead people into the invisibility, so they think, oh, I see, it goes invisible over time. This, I really think, looks like something dangerous, as if something's going to kill me randomly. Because you've got these three coloured blocks here and these things, so it looks like some lasers are going to shoot out, and that puts me on edge a bit. In fact, I wonder if that is even a trap. I don't know. So I try and simplify that area a bit. I don't know what the purpose of the exclamation mark is, to be honest. Maybe it's just style, but it looks like it's communicating something to me. If it's just style, maybe you want to try and make it blend into the background a bit. So again, we have another jumping element. I've learned by now that if I jump down here, it'll catapult me into the ceiling. That's great. So you're building on a theme, an established theme. But if you need to communicate to somebody that this functions as a catapult, or anything else, you have mechanics in your map that you need to communicate to people, you should do so in a safe manner. So players, there's no risk of them dying. So in order to progress to the next section, for instance, somebody jumps on this earlier in the map, then they would learn, oh, this is a catapult, and then use the same thing later on in the map, so they'd get used to it. But simples. All right, so trap design. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Oh, I see. Oh, that's clever. Gone full circle, sort of thing. Okay, so let's talk about difficulty ramping. When you build a Deathrun map, in my opinion, it's best to start off with easy traps and then have your hardest traps at the end. And also, it's best to start off with the traps which are designed to accommodate the largest number of players, and have the traps that are only designed to accommodate a small number of players towards the end. Like I said in Steamworks Extreme, the first trap is breaking platforms, and then you have these little platforms that come up from below. Maybe you've not played Steamworks Extreme, but the problem I had was that these platforms were very small, and you had up to 30 players going through them at once. And having several players all occupy the same space at once is uncomfortable. So what you should have is nice broad passageways for the starting areas, corridors that people can run down. If you prefer not to do that, if you want to keep the whole parkour element going on, then instead of that, what you could have is multiple sets of platforms. You can have up to 4 platforms so that players can divide themselves along those platforms themselves. The problem with that, of course, is that if you have more platforms, then it can become even more visually noisy. So that plays into what I was saying earlier on about simplifying the background. The more foreground elements you have, the simpler the background should be so that you can concentrate. This thing here is an interesting element to introduce to people at the start of the map, but it's a little bit too difficult in my opinion. You do repeat this later in the map, which is great. So what I would suggest you do is use this as an opportunity to teach players about how to avoid this this kind of obstacle. So I would make these platforms larger so that the jumping is not too difficult, and then players realise that it's a platform, they just have to avoid the laser. These things here, I think they're a bit too quick. I also think they're a bit confusing. You've got 2 kind of rotations to focus on. Also, the platforms do not become dangerous at exactly the same time, or do they? Yes, they do. Okay. Just to make things a bit easier to comprehend, I would make these a bit slower. And I would also have them all rotating in the same direction, because people can get a better sense of timing there. You might think, oh god, no, that makes it too easy, but unfortunately that's what you have to do in Deathrun. You have to make traps which are really, really easy, because there's some players who just do not have the skill, unfortunately, myself included. I don't really have the patience these days, to be honest. Yeah, so you have to provide for these players as well, who just want to come on, play a bit of Deathrun, practice things and get better. These white spikes here, because they're overlaying each other, makes it really difficult to see. What you might want to do is make them a darker colour, or perhaps make them transparent. Again, if you were to increase the width of these, they could accommodate more than 1 player at a time. But you'd still retain the same hazard. I don't know if you're aware, but you can have multiple brush volumes tied to the same trigger hurt. So you could have 1 trigger hurt for all of the spikes here, just consisting of multiple brushes. These items here, I believe that the brushes spin too quickly. Think about the spinners you see in mini-games. They start off slow and they get faster, but the problem you have here is you have multiple hazardous elements to deal with. The first one is easy-ish because players just have to jump over 1 spinner, but you can't really see where it's coming from, so you don't have a lot of time to react to it, so you really have to get that rhythm down. And unfortunately, you spend a lot of time in the air jumping, and so there's not really a lot of time for you to actually move. And then you have these little platforms in the middle. I don't think these little platforms are really necessary. I think this trap on its own is enough. So I would just have another walkway. I'd increase the space between each of these spinner sections and provide players a rest point, an actual dedicated rest point, a nice big chunky platform where they can take time to relax and think about things and what's going on. I'd also reduce, well, I think I said that, I reduced the speed of the spinner, didn't I? Yeah. This next section, you keep the same speed spinner as the old one, like I just said, reduce the speed. And you also introduced a second element for people to have to worry about. So not only do they have to contend with the spinner, they also have to do this. But the problem with this is it's not actually obvious what you have to do. Now I'm guessing there is an invisible trigger hurt somewhere, I'm not entirely sure. But again, it's just not obvious. So what I would do is I would simplify this. I would get rid of this and just make it one U shape that goes from there to here to there and then over here again. And then in the middle I would put one of those force field thingy majigs that I was talking about earlier on to show players that they cannot just jump through it. For the floor, you also need to communicate that the floor is dangerous now. So you should use a different kind of material. You could use a force fieldy material if you wanted to, or you could invent a new material to indicate a hazardous floor. Perhaps some kind of scrolling material that increased and decreased in brightness or something, I don't know. So just to summarize here, simplify this objective because it's already difficult enough as it is. The lasers, get rid of those because people would expect to be killed by them, so it doesn't make sense to have any there really. This section, I'm not entirely sure what you actually have to do here. I'm guessing these move up and down, so I can't really comment. And then you've also got the laser sticking out here. I should think that's probably sufficiently difficult, to be honest. This prevents people from just darting straight in, which is fine. I don't think this needs to be flashing at you. I think that's a bit difficult to view, so I would just replace that with another force field. Get rid of this white material and just have a nice material like these so people can orient themselves in the world. Here you're introducing strafe jumping to people. You know what? It never occurred to me to try taking the left side, to be honest. I don't know why that is, because surely you should be able to stand on the edge of the platform and jump down there. But people only went on the right side that I saw, so maybe they think that this side kills them, or maybe they're correct in thinking that. Why should we go right if the left side is easier? So I would get rid of that if it's not actually in use. Maybe duplicate it as well, because again, hopefully you'll have quite a few players by this point. Probably not in reality, but if you do have quite a few players, then it doesn't make sense to kind of trap them all into this narrow section. I appreciate that it's good to have multiple hazardous elements here, but you've got like 3 things that people need to worry about. One is the strafe jumping, which is made difficult by the rotating platforms. And then you've also got these moving things. So you've got quite a complex trap there, so you want to simplify it a bit, I'd say. Maybe make these platforms larger. So perhaps what you could do is have them on the middle. Don't have them rotating. So players can jump left or right around the lasers, depending on whatever they find most comfortable. And you could just have one of these moving things that goes backwards and forwards. I think that would be better, and then make it a bit slower. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't really look like a platform either. It just looks like trimming. It looks like decoration because you've made it blend in with the background. If you have a walkable surface, try and make that the brightest thing rather than the sides, so players know that that is where they need to walk. It looks cool, but you know. Again, get rid of this white thing because it's visually uncomfortable. If you must have landing spots that have doorways, make them longer because players are likely to bunch up here and it's going to get a bit messy. I don't really see the point in the doors myself anyway. It doesn't really do anything. I like this area, I like the look of it. You already know my thoughts about this button. This, you've got too much going on here. You've got a catapult. When I approached it, I had no idea it was a catapult. You've got these lasers, and you've got this spinning thing. I don't think players should have to contend with this. Once they get off the final platform, they should not be forced to time their jumps. They should just be able to jump on, catapult themselves up, and here they should have a nice, safe jumping off point. I don't know what you're supposed to do here. It's not obvious to me. I'm guessing somehow the ceiling is involved. I really just have no idea. So I think that needs to be much better communicated to people about what's going to happen. Is it some kind of reverse monkey bar situation? Could you maybe have a transparent material that indicates the line that people should take, like a racing line simulator you see in racing games, so that they know the approximate direction that they're going or where they should go? So this just looks like another strafing thing to me, but I can't see anything to strafe on unless it's strafing on invisible platforms. But again, you've not really introduced us to this concept of having to look at the ceiling for an invisible platform at this stage in the map. So rather than introduce players to a new mechanic whilst also forcing them to do something really tricky like strafe jumping, you should introduce them to a mechanic in an easier setting with low risk. And don't punish them so much by these lasers and things. Feels really unfair. I don't quite know what the purpose of this thing is. It's flashing at me, so it suggests to me that this is a gameplay element. If it's just for decoration, I would tone it down a bit, or make it obvious that I cannot access it by putting a brush in front of it and covering it off. Something like that, if you can. Or maybe just having another source of lasers or whatever. Or in fact just having like one of them force field things that I suggested earlier on, so players know that if they touch the force field they're going to die. Again, I'm guessing it's a catapult, so use a catapult texture. Please don't have white floors, they're rather annoying. I would make these partially transparent so players can actually see through them, because I could not see where to go when I was standing up there. Also, I think you should make this a bit wider because it's a bit punishing on people, or maybe the vertical distance between each of these drops a bit higher. You're introducing players to a new concept again, which they've not yet experienced in the map. So either what you could do is you could introduce them to something like this earlier in the map, which is less difficult, and then give them a harder version later on, or you could just make this easier. You've got quite a few interesting elements in this map that I think you're only using once and then never again. So rather than just having them appear once and then be really difficult, is maybe reuse them. So start with easier versions and then have more difficult versions later on, so players go to them and think, wow, I remember this, but oh my god, I've also now got to contend with this. What am I going to do? You know that when two players touch these platforms, they stop each other. One way you can get around that is by having a rotating brush, and then in its flags you choose passable and unblockable by players, and then your actual visible brushes you make into a func brush and you parent them to the rotating brush. It's not perfect, it doesn't always work. Another thing is you can do is you can have a trigger which sets an property on the player, add output solid, and I think it's 4, I can't remember, but it basically makes them non-solid to other players, so when they touch each other they don't collide. Another map that we tested recently by Sholton Time, PQ, uses a similar system. You might want to ask us in the Discord server or speak to Shockwave or that player that I mentioned to find out how it's done. I don't know the details. So you've got this increasing difficulty here, which is fantastic. You're using an element that the players have already experienced, and it gets harder. And by this point, there should be fewer players as well, so there shouldn't be as much vying for space. But I feel like the trigger hertz that you've got on the lasers don't fully. Maybe the laser should be less noisy and more sharp. so players get a better idea of where the actual pain point is, if you know what I mean. These white rotating things make a return, but again they're very difficult to see on the backdrop because you've got the white lasers. So either you want to make the floor less noisy, blah 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 blah. Make them a bit slower as well. This laser, up until now, we've been taught that lasers are dangerous, so for it to suddenly be a safe laser is a bit confusing. I think you're over-relying on these white rotating things a bit and some lasers. I would try and come up with some new ideas for hazardous elements. And they don't always have to be moving as well. They can be static hazardous elements, such as lasers or force fields or whatever. Perhaps what they could be also is sentries. So maybe you could have these little spheres, for instance, these shiny spheres which have electricity coming from them, and they would move left and right, like platforming games, you know? Little characters and stuff that inhabit your world. At this point, these platform sections just feel a little bit overdone now as well, I think. Maybe you could come up with some new ways to convey players. So for instance, you could use a conveyor belt. You could have like these sections be conveyors so players can run along them. And when they're forced to wait here, they also have to sort of stand on the conveyor and move. You could also have moving platforms that go through things. Maybe not, actually. Maybe not. Or bridges which kind of appear and then disappear. No, I don't know. Something like that anyway. Just something to shake it up a little bit. For visibility optimization purposes, it might be better to extend this section here. So maybe you could kind of make these tubes longer. Then when people get in them, they get kind of flung forwards, maybe even teleported into this section. Or not, actually don't teleport people, sorry, because then that makes your activator corridor a bit complicated. But if you're standing in here, you can also see in that room as well. Probably not a major issue because there's not really a lot going on in here. I think this platform here should go a little bit further to the left because it's difficult to jump on. You think that because this is the jumping off point that it should go all the way to the left, but it doesn't. It sort of stops, and I think that's because it's a track train, and the problem with track trains is that they're a nuisance, unfortunately. When they get to the end of their train, their path, sorry, they sort of don't quite reach the path, and they kind of jump back immediately. Maybe it is a front door, I don't know. But in any case, if you just extend this section a bit, maybe even have it going all the way up to here, because there's no real need to restrict players in this way. You know, at least allow them to get on here. These rotating things, again, a little bit overdone. Maybe you want to think about some other system. And because the platforms move at a fixed speed, I'm wondering if it's actually possible to avoid them. Perhaps what you should do is make the platforms wider so that players have more room to move, so they can avoid the white things a bit easier. I thought that you'd have to go left and then over here, but I didn't actually realise that there's a jumping off point here. What I would do is... Oh, you have to jump through the lasers? I'm not sure. That's not obvious, to be honest. Let's have a look. Okay, so these platforms meet here. Boom! And you've got a very short window to jump through them. And the platform, for some reason, goes through lasers. Okay, not entirely sure why that is. Presumably you have to move. But because the lasers are so difficult to see, you can't really... And you don't really have enough time to avoid them. So I would extend this and make the lasers easier to see. Also use, they're probably beams actually. Beams, I think beams, it could be, I'm not sure, one or the other. One of them hits brushwork and then stops. The other one actually goes all the way through. So I think lasers go all the way through. But again, it would be easier if you just used a force fieldy thing. So yeah, maybe what you could do is have these platforms here be synchronized. So for some section, for some distance, they ride alongside each other and give players a longer opportunity to jump from one to the other. You could make the section a bit wider, longer, and then you could have this kind of dodging mechanic a bit later on, because you kind of jump from one straight into the other. There's no time to adapt. You could also have a little bit of a rest point as well. Again, this jumping off point here, make it wider so people realise that they can stay there. Otherwise, you're going to have people standing here working out what to do, and then other people are going to be standing on them and getting in the way. Strafe jumps, I did say make these transparent, but I would also say make these white things slower and make them all move the same way. So you've got the outside two moving in one direction and you've got the inside two moving in another direction. The problem is you have all this stuff going on in front of you, so it becomes more difficult to track. But if they're all moving in the same direction, it's easier to understand, you know? Also, another thing what you could do is you could perhaps take these white things, and rather than having them 4 up the left and 4 up the right, is having their central axis, or their axis, centered inside these brushes here, so they actually spin clockwise or whatever. So the one side, this is going clockwise, you can jump under it, and the other side you can wait for it to pass and go over it, depending on player preference or whatever. That will also reduce edicts a little bit as well. Arrows probably a little bit unnecessary, but presumably they're for style reasons. Again, this is a jumping off point, so I would have this much wider. It's not obvious that this is the path you must take, so perhaps what you should do, this just looks like somebody painted it on. I don't know what you could do here actually. It just looks rather strange. It looks like I'm supposed to jump down there. Maybe what you could do is have one on the floor and one on the ceiling, because the fact that they're both on the floor and the ceiling makes it obvious that you should not be able to walk on them. But I guess you want to make this the easy part and that the most difficult part. But I don't really think you need to make it difficult, to be honest, because it's difficult enough as it is, because you've got this timed cronk coming at you. And then the final piece, I don't quite know why, but you have these tiny bits on the floor and these tiny bits here. You've probably made these easier. You realise you had some problems, so you actually turn these into white bits, but they fade into the background quite easily because the background has white lines on it. So I would make these a different colour, or have the background rather plain, so that they stick out more. And that's it really. So overall, yeah, difficulty ramping again. I think you need to start easier and get more difficult over time. Aside from that, if you made things a bit easier, I think you probably have too few traps, which is a good thing, because if you did make things easier, you'd be able to reintroduce some of those elements later on in more difficult places, or as more difficult traps. But there's a danger there that you would make people get bored, because the map is all just the same stuff. It's all platform hopping and what have you. And I haven't even spoken about like what the activator's got to do. You've fallen into the same trap as Neo-Noir. You've made a map which is mostly about kind of parkour and automated hazards, and so the activator doesn't really have anything to do. Which I appreciate is rather difficult. How do you introduce manually activated traps into a map which is already extremely hard? You can't really, can you? So that requires some thought, I think, because you need to come up with traps which are not unfair, and you also need to communicate to players what's going to happen. And because everything is just colours and blocks, that's a bit tricky. So you need to come up with a way to demonstrate to players that this particular hazardous element is activator controlled. So earlier on in the map you could have the activator visible with a couple of traps, and then you could have the button visible as well, and then the things which are activator controlled, you could have a specific texture or colour, so like a hazard stripe or something, I don't know. Like they could be blue because traditionally the activator is blue, so they could be blue stripes or whatever. Or maybe you could make another texture, and then when players see them they think, ah, so that's what the activator controls. And then in the future, when the activator is no longer seen, the players will see these elements which are activator controlled, and they will know that that is likely to be triggered at some point. And then of course you would either kill them or change colour or whatever. Yeah, I think in a map like this it becomes less about catching people out with traps and more about kind of playing God, controlling the environment. So for instance, you get to choose between a bunch of things. So imagine if the activator were given, say, a bunch of paths to choose from, or maybe a bunch of platforms, that kind of thing. Or maybe they could have like credits to spend that they could put into traps. Sorry. So let's say, for instance, they started the round with 10 credits, and you could display them on screen using game text or a screen overlay. Okay, I've lost sight of the activator sections completely now. So I'll just talk about traps. Yeah, so they could put like a different number of tokens into a trap to make it harder or easier. So that would be pretty cool. It'd be a bit tricky, but you could pull it off as long as you communicated to players that way. So you could have game text that said activator credits 10, and then you could have like signs around maps that say 3 credits around the map around traps that say, you know, 3 credits put in here or whatever. You could base it on an arcade if you wanted to, but you'd have to be careful to avoid criticism there from it being too similar to neo-noir and all that jazz, tech-noir. I don't understand why, but here we are. For some reason, I'm kind of in the void, and I'm going through sections, and it's kind of, yeah, it's almost like you've got bits of the map which are, I don't understand it, like voidy bits. So I'm trying to get to the activator corridor. I think this is it. Oh, here we are. Right, okay. So I recommend against using top-down activator corridors because while you're looking down, you then have to sort of like look up and hit a button. The button can obscure your view. You often have to crouch to hit a button. It's better to have a side-on activator corridor. Also, try to avoid teleporting the activator around. Always try and have a continuous corridor for the activator, because when you teleport the activator, they very easily lose track of the red players. They don't know where they are in the world. And if you do what neo-noir has, where the activator corridor just becomes a set of small rooms, then you can teleport like a third of the way through the map, and all you can do is wait for them. You don't know where they are. You don't even know if they've rushed and bypassed you. So how are you supposed to know how far forwards and backwards you're supposed to run? Whereas if you had a continuous activator corridor, you'd be able to keep your eyes on the runners all the time. You might think, oh, that's a lot of work, but if you design your map well, you can do it. So you could make the actual red sections, you could build them around the activator corridor. So if you started by designing your activator corridor, for example, making it a big square, then you could build your Deathrun course around that, for instance. I'd always put your activator corridor on the inside of turns. So for here, the activator corridor would be on the left there. If you put it on the inside of things, then that means they don't have to run as far as the runners do. So they don't have to rush to keep up. But in your map, I don't think that's going to be a problem anyway, because there's lots of things to slow people down. You're not going to have problems with rushers. But you also have a section of map at the start there, which is quite long. So running backwards and forwards takes a while. You do appear to have a speed lane, but it would also be useful to have a speed lane in the opposite direction as well, I think. Yeah, so I think that's all I'm going to say for now. You're always welcome in the Discord server. Hopefully you found our feedback useful. So good. I look forward to the next version. Oh, and a word on versions as well is, now that you've got beta 1 up, I don't know if you plan on doing this anyway, so I'll tell you anyway. But try and leave it a bit before you release a new version. Gather some playtesting data, get all the feedback from people, and then write it all down, put it into a plan, and then plan your next version, and then make all the changes you need to make, and then release a version. If you keep on releasing new versions all the time with just small changes in, it becomes more difficult for players and server operators to keep track. Server operators don't update their maps very often. They will upload a new map if they see it, because they obviously want to attract attention to their servers. They want people to play on them. But if they have to change the map often, then they're just going to stop bothering after a while because it's too much hassle. Also, if you don't make changes if you don't make big changes with each new version, then people will just leave you the same feedback over and over again, thinking that you haven't paid any attention to what they said because they haven't seen any changes in your map. There's also a few other things that you might need to do as well. One thing is cube maps. The map doesn't have any cube maps. Not terribly important because your map doesn't really have any reflective materials, but player cosmetics do. For instance, my bells as a pyro, they do reflect the environment. So I would look into building cube maps for the map as well. What it means is that any reflective materials will actually reflect the environment around them, so it just enhances the atmosphere a bit. Repacking as well. When your map is downloaded, it's in a RAR file, which is fine. When server operators upload it to their server, they have to put it in a BZ2, which is a compressed file format. They also have to upload a copy to their game server outside of an archive, uncompressed. And uncompressed, the map is 116 megabytes, which is quite large, and obviously spaces at a premium on servers and also client hard drive spaces. There's this thing you can do called repacking, and it's a little bit like compressing your map in an archive like a RAR, but you're actually compressing the insides of the BSP file, and it's done in the game using the console command BSP repack. So if you just type that command, it'll tell you how to use it, BSP repack, and then you type in the map.bsp and then the output map.bsp. You can use the same map name if you want, you can use a different one, it's entirely up to you. What that'll do is it'll internally compress each of the lumps, and what you'll be left with is a map which is the same size as a compressed map, but it is still the original BSP-ish. So what you can do is you can upload that to Game Banana, servers can upload it to their servers, their web servers, clients can download it, and it'll always be in each one of these locations compressed, that 50 megabytes. So as you can imagine, it saves a lot of file space. If you use CompilePal to compile your maps, that also has a repack step that you can add. But repacking should be the very last thing that you do. After you've compiled the map, you've packed your custom assets, and after you built cube maps, repacking is the final step. If you upload your map to the workshop, you don't have to repack it. You can do that whilst it's still uncompressed. Cool. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us on the Death Experiments Discord server if you like. We'll be more than happy to help you, and I hope you found our feedback useful.